Hello, and welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm your host, ILTV Editor-in-Chief, Maayan Hoffman.
And I'm the often grumpy news editor, Steve Leibowitz.
So after a long wait, Netanyahu finally scored a meeting with President Biden at the White House. Biden had been hesitant to arrange it ever since Netanyahu returned to power with his hard-right coalition in late 2022. But as always, the unexpected popped up. First, the new Wing of Zion plane, Israel's version of Air Force One, was set to make its debut flight to Washington. Turns out it could only fit 60 passengers, so it had to make a preliminary trip with some staff and equipment, ensuring there'd be room for Netanyahu, his team, security, journalists, and freed hostages on the second flight. Then, out of nowhere, COVID-19 made a comeback, and it was back in the headlines with President Biden, who caught it. Thankfully, his symptoms were mild, but it meant Netanyahu's trip and their White House meeting got pushed back a few days. The latest reports are that Biden and Netanyahu will only meet on Thursday, a day after Netanyahu's speech to Congress.
Well, Maayan, I'm not so sure if and when a meeting between Biden and Netanyahu will even be held at the White House. President Biden is not expected to leave Delaware until he tests negative. Other potential meetings also not certain. It's a time of political upheaval in the U.S. I'm not even sure they want Netanyahu there. Biden is now out, and Vice President Kamala Harris appears to have an inside track for the Democratic nomination, but it's unclear when she'll have time for Netanyahu. And the potential meeting with Republican nominee and recent assassination attempt survivor Donald Trump. The former president has yet to confirm a meeting request. At least Netanyahu will be scheduled to address Congress tomorrow.
Yeah, it's going to be up in the air, and we're all going to be watching with bated breath to see how things turn out there in the White House. But in order for us to really be able to discuss this, Steve, it's great to talk to you, but I figured we should bring in some guests. So we have two very special guests with us today in the studio. We have former member of Knesset, Alon. Welcome, Alon.
Great to be here.
And of course, on Zoom, we have from Washington, JTA's Washington Bureau Chief, Ron Kampeas. Thanks for joining us, Ron. Netanyahu has been waiting for this visit, as we said, really wanting to go to Washington for almost 2 years now. And days before his arrival, President Biden announced his resignation. However, as we discussed, they are still planning to meet, assuming he recovers from COVID. Tell me, Ron and Alon, is this political turmoil a blessing or a curse? Alon, why don't you start? And then, Ron, you can take the answer.
Well, if you're a Democrat, certainly the political turmoil is basically a good thing because there was a sure loss and they were heading down there. In terms of Netanyahu's visit, I'm not sure how it's going to play out. I think that as an Israeli politician and I would say a patriot, I find it very, very troubling that I am myself conflicted and ambivalent about this particular visit. In other words, there is a sense that Netanyahu is going to take advantage of this cynically to promote his own political agendas. And many of us are still in trauma from his 2015 visit, in which he took a shot at President Obama, a shot which has left Democrats, I think, angry to this day. And in fact, I went back and checked Nancy Pelosi's initial response was one of actual fury, and indeed, she's talking about boycotting the speech. So the fact that an Israeli prime minister is not leading a bipartisan visit, this is really the issue that concerns me.
Well, even though the case is that he was invited by the Republicans and the Democrats.
Yeah, but the Democratic Party is divided on Israel. And one would think that perhaps a different prime minister might have reduced the particular disagreements. And those disagreements, incidentally, reflect what's going on in Israeli society.
So, Ron, do you feel the same way?
I think in terms of, yes, the reception he's going to get is probably going to be even more pronouncedly negative from the Democratic side than it was in 2015, when I think 58 Democrats boycotted the speech. There's no solid numbers yet as to the number of Democrats boycotting the speech, but Patty Murray, for instance, who's the president pro tempore of the Senate, in other words, the longest serving person in the Senate, and therefore she has certain privileges, she's not coming to the speech. That's already a blow for Netanyahu. The boycott didn't reach such senior levels last time. So, yeah, in terms of negative impressions, that's not going to look good for Israel or for Netanyahu. And Alon's right. The 2015 speech, I think, was a breaking point for a lot of Democrats. There was really a lot of resentment at what he had done. The optics are a little different then. What happened then is that the day after Barack Obama gave his State of the Union speech, John Boehner announced that he was coming. And Boehner didn't consult with Pelosi. He put her name on the bottom of the letter, but didn't consult with her. So that made things worse than it is now, because Mike Johnson made sure that he did have the consent of the others. But the optics were that you had a black president saying, this is my outlook, this is my Iran policy. And the next morning, John Boehner actually put it this way: we're going to have a more serious take when Benjamin Netanyahu comes next month. And it really looked as if, unintentionally, it looked as if Netanyahu was colluding with Boehner and upbraiding the first black president. And that's why a lot of the people who didn't come that time were members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including ones who were otherwise sympathetic to Israel.
But Ron, what about in the streets? There are reports that there are going to be large mass protests of anti-Israel demonstrators in Washington. Any signs of that yet? And do you expect protests in the streets during the congressional talk?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Answer, which is a far-left organizing group, has said that there are going to be at least 5,000 people in the streets, and multiple, I think even more difficult for Netanyahu, multiple hostage families and people who are sympathetic to the hostage families are planning protests. The Unacceptable Movement, which is the Israeli diaspora movement of that started during the judicial reform, is planning a big turnout. In that sense, I think maybe the turmoil in the States actually works in Netanyahu's favor, because whereas they might have got all those people might have got a lot of attention in a quiet week, most political reporters are tracking what's going on with the Democrats, with Kamala Harris effectively getting the presidential nomination now.
Alon, let me turn to you. What do you expect will be the actual thrust content of the speech? Or let me put it this way. Will there be the big headline, a hostage deal has been reached, we're moving forward? Will Bibi say those words? I know he's not going to say the words two-state solution, because that would be going way beyond Bar Ilan, but can he at least say the hostage deal is moving forward? The entire security establishment says it's okay.
Steve, unfortunately, the age of prophecy is behind us. So I do have fantasies about him going that far. What I do think he's going to do, I think he will be gracious to President Biden, who has been an incredible supporter of Israel during this difficult time, probably the last president of a generation that understood the Holocaust and was an unabashed Zionist. I think he'll do that. And I think that he's going to talk about three things: Iran, Iran, and Iran. Because indeed, as
not going to talk about the war?
No, the point is he's going to talk about the proxies, and he's going to try to frame the war as part of America's overall battle for the heart and soul of the Middle East.
He's not going to focus on the hostages.
I think right now,
they'll be very disappointed. I mean, many of them didn't want him to go at all.
Well, I also felt that it would have been well to come in, but who knows? Maybe he's going to surprise us with Biden with such an announcement. That would be, but you know, we all have been waiting for so long for this. I would really be loath to make such a prediction and then be disappointed again.
Well, and I think, though, that it's interesting because Biden is going to have to be thinking about what is his legacy really going to be? What is he going to leave behind? And we know that some of that legacy now, given the last 9 months and his involvement with Israel, will need to be tied to either some kind of hostage deal, a ceasefire agreement, or a Saudi deal, which does not look like it's on the table anymore. Ron, I'd love to jump back to you, actually, to think about that. You know, how does Biden's resignation actually impact the conversation that we expect him to have, hopefully on Thursday, with Netanyahu? What do you expect the nature of that to be? What announcements will be made after? And do you think there'll be some kind of legacy in the making that could at least start to be on the table during that meeting?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I forget who used this. I think it was Biden who used this. I think it's going to be a come to Jesus moment for Bibi when he meets with Biden on Thursday, in the sense that Biden is, to use Kamala Harris's favorite phrase, is unburdened by the past because he is now a lame duck president. He doesn't have to he doesn't have to worry about his legacy. And if you want to look at the historical parallel, Ronald Reagan was also a president who had a sometimes tense relationship with Israel, particularly when Menachem Begin was in power, but was overall, you know, hewed to the what at the time were the pro-Israel parameters, the AIPAC parameters. But what did he do just as he was leaving office in order not to burden his successor, H.W. Bush? He effectively recognized the PLO, which, you know, it was the only circumstance in which you can do it. And now Biden is in a position to do something equally as dramatic. He can do something in the next 6 months and say, this is my initiative as a president. It doesn't redound on Kamala Harris, especially if Kamala Harris wins in November. That would be a real difficult time for Netanyahu, I think, because Biden would be unleashed. To say, as Alon has said, that this is like one of the most pro-Israel presidents that has ever been. So he's not going to go too far. He's not going to go crazy. He's not hostile to Israel at all. He does have a very difficult relationship with Netanyahu, however.
Right, a long-standing but difficult relationship.
His spokesperson has already tried to frame it. On the one hand, he gave Israel almost unqualified military support, but his legacy in terms of how his spokespeople are branding it is President Biden's intervention provided huge protection for the people of Gaza, a lot of humanitarian support, and I think it's true. Without American heavy-handedness, there would have been a much greater civilian toll.
Well, and it's very possible. And if, Ron, I actually want to jump back to you in some of what you were talking about in terms of, if Kamala Harris wins. Well, Kamala Harris right now, we don't know, of course, until August, but does appear to be the likely candidate for president on the Democratic side. And Bibi is supposed to meet with Kamala. We don't know when, but we assume that it will happen. Now that this role has shifted, that Kamala is no longer, she's still vice president, but is looked at as a presidential candidate, how will that meeting change? Do you think that there will be any particular statements that need to come out there or dynamics that we need to be watching for? Could this actually impact her candidacy, the way that this meeting goes?
Yeah, I think that if there's statements that come out of the meeting, first of all, I think a meeting is probably in her interest to show that she's deeply involved in foreign policy in Israel. It's also in her interest to reassure a lot of Jewish voters, the pro-Israel and Jewish donors to the party, who are quite a substantive proportion of the party. If she comes out and says all the right things about October the 7th, about sharing Israel's goal of pushing Hamas out of the Gaza Strip, of eliminating Hamas in the Gaza Strip, that could be important for her and would also be good for Netanyahu to show that he has a relationship with one of the two likely next presidents. I mean, you could even come out of there looking better than he does currently with Donald Trump, because he's having such difficulties meeting with him, and Donald Trump really does not like him because Netanyahu congratulated Biden after Biden won the election.
Well,
that's what it boils down
Ron,
to.
let's address that literal elephant in the room, wounded elephant, albeit Netanyahu has not yet scheduled a meeting with Trump. Trump is playing a little bit hard to get. He did make some negative comments about Israel and its leadership during this war. But doesn't Trump need this meeting with Netanyahu in order to sort of compete for the Jewish vote and show
or more for the evangelical vote? I mean, come on, it's the Christian vote.
So he's as pro-Israel as Biden and way beyond, like he claims to be?
I don't know if Trump needs it so much. He's going to get the evangelical vote anyway. No evangelical who's like voting because Israel's top of docket for them is going to vote for Joe Biden. They're going to vote for Trump, and he has Jewish Republicans lined up very, very solidly behind him. I have to say, they are not. Nobody's defecting to Kamala Harris among Jewish Republicans. Absolutely, there is a lot of concern about what a second Trump term would mean for Israel and for the Jewish community. I think that there is a lot of concern that J.D. Vance comes from the isolationist wing of the policy, and it has to always be said that he makes a very explicit exception for Israel as far as that isolationism goes, but that's still a worry for the traditional robust America's presence in the world type of Jewish Republican. And J.D. Vance Trump was persuaded to hire J.D. Vance, so to speak, by Tucker Carlson, who is openly engaging in Jew baiting and anti-Semitic theory on his channel, and those are worries for the Jewish Republicans, but I don't think it eats into it. Doesn't threaten to diminish support for Trump among the faithful right now.
Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate, who, by the way, is not going to be in Congress. Apparently, he's not boycotting, but there's some kind of a hillbilly convention. But let's talk just for a second. Both of you can comment on this. We were talking about it before the broadcast. Who's the right candidate for vice president? And I know that for the Democrats. And I know that there are a couple of potential Jewish candidates in the mix. Alon, your
true.
ideas, and I'd like to go back to Ron with that.
For full disclosure, I grew up in North Carolina, so it seems to me that Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, who is now term limited and leaving, would be the perfect candidate.
Jewish.
Not Jewish, which is maybe, I would say, an advantage given the significant other that Kamala Harris brings her. But I think the fact, if you're trying to...
Jewish.
But of these purple states that have to go Democrat, if he can deliver Georgia and North Carolina, which I believe he can, which are very close there, and bring over the so-called the moderate white voters there, I think that'd be a huge thing. Of course, the governor of Pennsylvania is things, but it seems to me...
Shapiro
is... but my gut says that it would work well. I might add that the interesting story about Roy Cooper is that the Democratic candidate for governor of North Carolina, Stein, is the Jewish Attorney General, and it would be the first Jewish governor of North Carolina ever.
And he would take over for
and
it.
if Roy Cooper threw his weight into this, I think that could actually give the 2 or 3% he needs to defeat the Republican challenger.
What's the betting line in Washington, Ron? Who's going to be the vice presidential candidate for Kamala? What are they saying in the streets?
Well, certainly all the names that Alon just put down, but also Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, whose wife, Gabby Giffords, is Jewish, who was shot in 2011, and she and her husband, Mark Kelly, established a gun control group in the wake of that, where Mark Kelly could really help. Kamala is Republicans are trying to frame her as being a failed border czar, because Biden, at the beginning of his presidency, gave her some responsibilities on the border, and the immigration is uncontrolled. Mark Kelly is very credible on the border, coming from a border state, being very conservative on border issues from a Democratic point of view. He really knows how to talk about the border, and like North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Georgia, Arizona is a swing state that the Democrats have to win.
And he's an astronaut, don't forget.
And he's an astronaut, that's right.
That's super cool. So I actually want to be able to spend some of our last time talking a little bit about the speech, again, that Netanyahu is going to be able to deliver in Congress, assuming that everything goes as planned on Wednesday. What do you think are the key points, that Netanyahu is going to make? Do you feel that you said Iran, but do you feel that beyond the positioning Israel as fighting the war for all of humanity, that Netanyahu will get in some political points? You mentioned that some people were nervous here, Alon, about his using this as a visit to pump himself up. So what are those messages that we'll be able to read between the lines?
We in Israel remember the Likud campaign, which was Netanyahu in another league, with pictures of him with sundry world leaders, be they Putin or at the time Trump or whatever. And so the subtext for Netanyahu, as he goes in there, is directed at his base. I am the world leader with the stature that Israel needs. Look at me. The Republicans asked me how many world leaders, or maybe Zelensky was the only other one this year, so that he wants to send that message. I still have what it takes to bring over the Americans, which quite frankly is something, as somebody who is a political opponent of Netanyahu, I'm not delighted to see. On the other hand, as somebody who believes it's very important that the Israeli message gets to the American people now, given the present thing, Netanyahu is a great communicator, so he will be a good speaker, I'm sure.
So, Ron, do you feel the same way? And I mean, America has been so I don't want to say America's anti-Israel, because the truth of the matter is the polls show that America is very pro-Israel.
75%
That's
still.
right. The majority of Americans are actually pro-Israel, but the acoustics have been very anti-Israel. We mentioned the protests already today. We mentioned some Congress people not showing up. Will not Netanyahu actually be able to successfully be an orator? That is his strength. But do you feel that it will work this time? Because I know here in Israel, I can say that as people hear him speak, they believe he's poised and he's proper, but maybe he's not delivering a message that we can all stomach anymore. Do you think that shift will also appear in Washington?
I think it could. I think, in 2015, whatever the demerits of that speech, he had a definite message in terms of how to contain Iran and how Iran posed a threat to the world. Here, what Congress people are going to be looking for, and I'm talking from the left to the right, is a credible day after scenario. They're going to want to hear Benjamin Netanyahu come up and say, look, we're spending all this money, we need all these weapons, because we are getting rid of Hamas, and this is what happens the day after. And he has been very untypically inarticulate about. He has not been able to articulate a day after the way that that others. I mean, his Yosef Gallant, who speaks fluent but very heavily accented English, he's much better at talking about a day after, and he doesn't have half the charisma Netanyahu, and that's a real deficit for Netanyahu, that because of his political reality in Israel, with being locked in by the far right, he's not able to articulate a credible or even viable or any kind of day after vision, and that could hamper his speech on tomorrow. So the visit's going to obviously come and go. It's going to go much faster than we think, and by Thursday, I guess at some point, so it's going to be over. If both of you could really just in a minute each paint what it would look like for success. If Netanyahu returns back to Israel, how will we know that he has been successful in this visit? Ron, why don't you take that, and then Alon? I think it'll be, a successful visit will include a photo op and a mutual admiration type society visit with Kamala Harris. It will include something similar with Biden, although that's not as critical at this stage, and a meeting with Donald Trump, if that happens. It'll show that, as Alon said, that Netanyahu really has the command of the American political scene from left to right. That's what a successful visit would look like.
Alon?
I'll put my partisan feelings aside and say, for me as an Israeli, after a year when Israel's image has been bashed and so much disinformation about the Israeli war effort has been coming to the fore, I think that Netanyahu can do a very good job in describing a war in which Israel was attacked, responded, made every effort to try to avoid civilian damage, and will return Israel's image as really a moral country that does share fundamental values with the United States. So I hope he does that, because it's extremely important that the most powerful nation on earth still sees Israel as one of its close allies and as a country that has the kind of moral decency that we'll support.
But to some extent, what his comments are going to be for internal consumption back here in Israel. Doesn't Netanyahu need, at this time, to emphasize a hostage deal and bring something home? The security establishment is pleading with him.
Yes.
Hostage families are pleading with him. The vast majority of the public wants the deal done now. A stoppage for 6 weeks won't necessarily end the war. Can he do that?
Certainly after yesterday's horrible news that 2 more hostages have died in captivity, there is a sense that that clock is counting down. So yes, that would be the real picture of success, a successful deal which gives us a ceasefire and brings them home.
All right, thank you so much. Well, that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you very much to our guests, Alon, Tal, and Ron Kampeas. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thanks for watching, Insider. Have a pleasant evening. Let's win this war and bring our hostages home.